When Michael Jackson's death was officially announced, the world moved quickly into reaction. News alerts, breaking headlines, replayed footage, a narrative that formed almost instantly, shaped by repetition rather than examination. For most people, the story began and ended with a single night in June 2009. But for the systems inside the house, the story did not end there. Hours after Michael Jackson was pronounced dead, devices that should have gone silent continued to behave as if something was still unfolding. Not dramatically, not violently, quietly, subtly, in ways that were easy to overlook unless someone was paying very close attention. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The house in Holmby Hills was secured. Personnel moved carefully. Evidence protocols were followed. Time was logged. Statements were recorded. The environment appeared calm, stable, complete. And yet, beneath that calm, something was still active. Digital systems do not understand death. They understand states, presence, absence, change. When a person leaves a space, systems register transitions, power shifts, motion decay, environmental stabilization. Normally, these transitions are smooth, predictable, orderly. That night, they were not. Several systems inside the residence failed to return to baseline. Audio buffers remained active longer than expected. Environmental sensors showed micro fluctuations long after the house should have settled. Internal clocks corrected themselves multiple times within minutes, as if struggling to agree on when the night had actually ended. None of this triggered alarms, none of it required intervention, but taken together, the behavior suggested something important. The environment had not fully resolved. This matters because systems are designed to stabilize once an event concludes, especially after a death. Motion stops, sound dissipates, power usage declines, data quiets. The house becomes empty in every measurable sense. Here, that emptiness did not register cleanly. One technician later described it as a delayed exit. Not a person leaving late, but a condition lingering longer than it should, as if the space itself had not yet accepted that what had happened was over. This was not recorded in any public report. It wasn't framed as an anomaly. At the time, it was simply noise, background behavior that didn't justify attention. Systems can be imperfect, sensors drift, logs misalign, until patterns emerge, and patterns did emerge. Between the time Michael Jackson was removed from the house and the early hours that followed, multiple independent systems registered brief, synchronized adjustments. Power draw shifted without cause. Environmental readings flattened abruptly, then resumed normal fluctuation. Internal logs showed corrections that did not correspond to any physical interaction. The house behaved as if it was closing something, not shutting down, not powering off, closing. That distinction is subtle, but important. Shutting down implies force. Closing implies completion. At no point did any device record a new event. There were no additional movements, no sounds, no entries or exits. And yet, the systems acted as if they were finishing a process that had begun earlier. This is where the timeline begins to feel unstable. Officially, the night had a clear ending, a time of death, a removal, a conclusion, but the systems did not align to that moment. They aligned later, as if the moment they were responding to did not match the moment recorded in reports. In technical forensics, this creates a problem because when systems agree with each other but disagree with the timeline, the issue is rarely malfunction. It is interpretation. Machines do not speculate. They react. And what they were reacting to was not visible. There is a tendency, after high-profile deaths, to compress events, to simplify, to reduce complexity into something manageable, a single cause, a single moment, a clean line between before and after, but systems resist that compression. They record, process, not narrative. And what they recorded that night suggested something unfinished. The most telling detail came not from sound or motion, but from timing. Several internal processes that should have ended simultaneously did not. Some resolved minutes later, others resolved hours later. A few corrected themselves multiple times, as if uncertain whether resolution had already occurred. This kind of behavior usually appears during ongoing activity, when people are still present, when movement continues, when the environment is in flux. None of that applied here. Michael Jackson was gone. The house was secured. The night was supposed to be over, and yet the systems hesitated, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to leave traces. At the time, no one connected those traces. There is no reason to. The story had already been told. The conclusion had already formed. But years later, when analysts revisited the raw data, not to challenge the outcome, but to understand the process, they noticed something unsettling. The systems did not behave as if they were responding to death. They behaved as if they were responding to a transition that did not align with it. And this raises a question that no report ever asked. If the night ended when we think it did, why did the systems wait? In the early hours following Michael Jackson's death, the house began to empty. Not emotionally, physically. Personnel left, equipment was removed, doors closed, lights were turned off one by one. The kind of routine that follows a finished event. But time inside the systems did not move as cleanly as the people did. Officially, the timeline was simple: a medical emergency, a response, a transport, a declaration. Everything documented, everything assigned a timestamp. On paper, the night progressed forward, minute by minute, without interruption. Inside the house, however, the clocks did not fully agree. Several devices recorded minor time corrections within the same window, not large jumps, not obvious errors, small adjustments. Fractions of a second repeated across different systems. Normally, this kind of correction happens once, automatically, when a device synchronizes with a master clock. Here, it happened multiple times, and not all at once. One internal system adjusted forward, another adjusted backward. A third logged a correction but showed no corresponding sync request. Each change on its own was harmless. Together, they formed something harder to dismiss. The house could not decide what time it was. This matters because time synchronization is one of the most stable processes in modern systems. Devices disagree briefly, then resolve. They do not hesitate. They do not oscillate. They do not correct, undo, and correct again unless something is interfering with their reference. That interference did not come from the outside. There were no network outages, no power failures, no maintenance events. The clocks were not broken. They were confused. As emergency responders moved through the space, their actions followed the official timeline perfectly. Doors opened when logged. Equipment was handled when recorded. Movements aligned with reports. Human activity made sense. Machine activity did not. Between the moment Michael Jackson was removed from the house and the time the residence was fully secured, several internal processes registered what forensic analysts later described as temporal hesitation. Processes paused longer than expected before completing. Logs closed slightly late. Idle states reactivated briefly, then shut down again, not enough to raise alarms, enough to suggest uncertainty, as if the systems were waiting for confirmation that never came. One analyst compared it to a sentence ending without punctuation. The meaning was clear, but the structure felt unfinished. The ambulance departure time was logged precisely. The declaration followed. From a human perspective, the sequence was complete, but the systems inside the house did not register closure at that point. They continued to adjust. The most unusual detail appeared when analysts aligned all time-based logs onto a single axis. When viewed separately, nothing stood out. When viewed together, a pattern emerged. The adjustments clustered around one narrow window. Not the moment of death, not the moment of departure, but a short span afterward. This suggested that the systems were not reacting to the event itself, but to something that followed it. In technical terms, this creates a paradox. Systems usually react to triggers, a sound, a movement, a command. Here, the reaction appeared after the trigger had already passed, which raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the trigger wasn't finished when we thought it was? No device recorded new activity. No sensor detected motion. No sound was captured. And yet, the systems behaved as if something was still resolving. Time, for them, had not settled. There is a known phenomenon in digital environments where systems struggle during transitions. Moments when states change faster than classification can keep up. Powering down, powering up, entering standby, exiting standby. But this was different. Nothing was changing anymore, except the interpretation. One internal note described it simply. Systems appear to be reconciling an event whose endpoint is unclear. That sentence was never included in any public-facing document because it did not accuse, it did not explain, it only observed. As the house finally went quiet, the systems gradually stabilized. Correction stopped. Idle states held. Time aligned again. But the alignment did not occur at the same moment for all systems. It happened in stages, which means that for a brief period, the house existed in overlapping versions of now. Not dramatically, not visibly, but measurably. And when time finally agreed with itself, the systems moved on. The night was closed, but not where we thought it was. By the time Michael Jackson arrived at the hospital, the narrative shifted. Responsibility moved from the house to the institution, from private space to clinical space, from uncertainty to protocol. Hospitals are designed to impose order. They stabilize, they classify, they record. Every action is time-stamped, every movement is logged. Every decision follows a structure meant to eliminate ambiguity. If there is any place where events should align cleanly, it is here. And on the surface, they did. Medical records showed a clear sequence: arrival, assessment, intervention, pronouncement. Each step documented with precision. The timeline appeared solid, professional, complete. But once again, the systems beneath the surface told a different story. Hospital environments are saturated with synchronized devices. Monitors, clocks, servers, backup systems, and diagnostic equipment all operate against shared time references. Unlike a private home, these systems are constantly cross-checking one another, which is why what happened next stood out. Several internal hospital logs recorded brief synchronization conflicts during the exact window when Michael Jackson was being treated. Not failures, not shutdowns, small disagreements, milliseconds apart, between systems that normally never drift. One monitoring system logged an action slightly before another system recorded the trigger for that action. Another device registered a status change without the expected preceding input. These discrepancies were tiny, invisible to staff, and irrelevant to medical outcome, but they were real. In isolation, each inconsistency meant nothing. Hospitals generate massive volumes of data. Minor misalignments happen. What made this different was the timing. The discrepancies clustered tightly around the same narrow window, the moment when intervention transitioned into conclusion. It was as if the systems could not agree on when that transition occurred. From the staff's perspective, everything unfolded normally. Procedures were followed. Decisions were made under pressure. There was no confusion, no hesitation, no sense that time itself was unstable. Machines, however, were less certain. One analyst later noted that several processes behaved as if they were finalizing an event that had not fully registered yet. Buffers stayed active slightly longer than expected. Status flags lingered before resolving. Logs closed, then reopened, then closed again. Not errors. Delays. Delays suggest waiting, and waiting implies uncertainty. Hospitals rarely wait. They move forward. Even in failure, systems advance cleanly from one state to the next. Here they appeared to pause, not physically, but computationally, as if something had not yet completed. This creates a subtle contradiction. The medical outcome was fixed, but the system response lagged behind it. In forensic analysis, this usually indicates one of two things: missing input or unresolved context. There was no missing input. All required data points were present: vital signs, staff actions, equipment readings. Everything needed to define the moment existed, which leaves unresolved context. The systems were receiving data, but they were not fully agreeing on how to interpret its endpoint. This became clearer when analysts compared hospital data to the residual activity recorded at the house. The stabilization patterns were similar, the same delayed resolutions, the same staggered returns to baseline, different environments, different equipment, same behavior. This suggested continuity, not between places but between states, as if the event the systems were responding to had not ended when the location changed. Officially, the house chapter closed when Michael Jackson left it. The hospital chapter began immediately after. Two separate environments, two separate timelines. The machines did not treat them as separate. They behaved as if they were still inside the same process. This does not imply malfunction. It implies that whatever the systems were reacting to was not tied to geography. It was tied to progression. Something was still unfolding. At some point during the hospital intervention, the discrepancy stopped. Buffers resolved. Logs aligned. Time corrected itself. The systems finally agreed. And when they did, the night moved on. From that moment forward, there were no more anomalies, no more hesitation, no more disagreement between clocks or processes. The systems accepted closure, but that acceptance did not coincide with the human understanding of when the event ended. It happened slightly later. This difference was never noted in any report. It did not affect care. It did not alter outcome. It did not demand explanation, but it exists. A small gap between when people believed the night was over and when the systems did. And once again, the same question emerged. If everything ended when we think it did, what were the systems waiting for? After the hospital timeline stabilized, the case moved into its quietest phase. No urgency, no motion, just records, reports, logs, the kind of material no one pays attention to unless something doesn't fit. This is where time becomes more than a reference. It becomes evidence. Every digital system involved in the night, the house, the ambulance network, the hospital, and the post-event processing systems produced timestamps. Individually, they looked correct. Each one followed its own internal logic. Nothing appeared broken. The problem was alignment. When analysts later placed these timestamps side by side, the sequence refused to settle into a single, coherent order. Events that should have followed one another appeared to overlap. Others seem to occur slightly before the conditions required for them to exist. Not minutes, not even seconds, milliseconds. But in forensic analysis, milliseconds matter. One log showed a system finalizing a process before another system recorded the input that should have triggered it. Another showed a confirmation arriving before the request was officially issued. These were not errors that caused failure. They were errors that caused discomfort because they suggested that the systems were not reacting in a straight line. Normally, timelines flow forward. Even when clocks drift, corrections resolve the issue quickly. Here, corrections occurred, but they did not fully agree with one another. Time kept correcting itself, but toward slightly different answers. This created a strange effect. No single system was wrong, but they could not all be right at the same time. Investigators described it as temporal compression, not missing time, but time folding inward. Instead of a clean sequence, the night appeared layered, as if multiple interpretations of now briefly existed side by side, each one valid within its own system, none of them dominant. This is not something humans experience. We perceive time as continuous because our senses demand it. Machines do not need that continuity. They operate on reference points, and when reference points conflict, machines do not panic. They hesitate. Several systems attempted to resolve the conflict automatically. They rechecked their clocks. They requested synchronization. They adjusted offsets. But those adjustments did not converge immediately. Instead, they clustered. Correction occurred close together, then paused, then occurred again, as if the systems were circling an answer they could not quite land on. What made this especially unsettling was where this clustering occurred, not during the emergency, not during transport, not during intervention. It occurred after the outcome, after the narrative had already settled. This suggests that the systems were not struggling to record the event itself, but to agree on when it ended. In one internal review, an analyst wrote a line that never left the draft stage. The systems behave as if the endpoint is unclear. That line was removed before publication because endpoints are supposed to be certain. Death is one of the most definitive endpoints we recognize. It has procedures, documentation, legal clarity. There is no ambiguity in how it is recorded. And yet, the systems treated the night as if closure was still being negotiated. This did not affect the official record. No report was changed, no conclusion was delayed. From a human perspective, the case moved forward cleanly. But from a systems perspective, something lingered. Time was still being adjusted long after it should have been fixed. Eventually, the correction stopped. Not suddenly, gradually. One system resolved first, then another, each settling into agreement at a slightly different moment. The night did not close all at once. It closed in pieces, and once the final alignment occurred, the system stopped reacting entirely. Logs stabilized. No further corrections were issued. Time, finally, agreed with itself. Only then did the data go quiet. This pattern mirrors what analysts had already seen in the house and later in the hospital. Different places, different systems, same behavior, which makes coincidence difficult to accept because coincidence does not repeat with structure, and structure implies process. The question is no longer whether the timeline is correct. It is whether the timeline was sufficient. If the systems required extra time to resolve the night, what were they resolving? Once the timeline finally settled, investigators expected clarity. Instead, they encountered something quieter. Not absence, not loss, silence that had been preserved. Security systems are designed with one purpose: to remember. Even when they fail loudly. Corrupted frames, frozen images, broken timestamps. Failure leaves debris. What they found here left none. Several internal security logs showed confirmation that recording processes were active during key intervals. Power was stable, storage was available, no alerts were triggered. Everything required to capture data was present. And yet, no usable record existed. This was not deletion. Deletion leaves marks. This was something else. In multiple systems, logs indicated that recording had started, remained active for a brief window, and then ended normally. No error codes, no forced shutdowns, no interruptions. The systems behaved as if nothing worth saving had occurred. This distinction mattered because the systems did not claim failure. They claimed completion. One technician reviewing the logs wrote a short note in the margin. Process executed. Output empty. That line became a problem because output is only empty when input is undefined. Machines do not decide relevance. They decide thresholds. Something had crossed those thresholds just enough to activate recording, but not enough to be retained. This is rare. Usually background noise, motion blur, or low-level interference still produces artifacts. A smudge, a flicker, a fragment of unusable data. Here, there was nothing. Not corrupted frames, not partial audio. Clean emptiness. When investigators compared this behavior to known cases, the closest matches were not security failures, but calibration events. Moments when systems briefly observe an environment to recalibrate their baseline. But calibration usually happens when a system is first installed, or after a major disruption, not in the middle of an otherwise normal night. This raised a difficult implication. The systems may not have been recording an event. They may have been re-evaluating the environment, as if something altered the baseline they used to define normal. This would explain why recording started quietly, ran briefly, and then stopped without leaving content behind. The systems weren't capturing activity, they were updating understanding. And once that adjustment was complete, recording was no longer necessary. From a technical standpoint, this is unsettling because it suggests the environment itself became ambiguous, not dangerous, not active, but unclear. And machines respond to ambiguity by narrowing focus, not expanding it. One analyst summarized it in a way that never appeared in the final documentation. The room registered presence without behavior. Presence without behavior is not something systems are built to handle well. Humans understand it instinctively. Machines do not. They need motion, sound, change, something measurable. When none of those resolve cleanly, systems retreat into neutrality. They stay quiet. Eventually, these silent records were archived like any other. No flags, no follow-ups, no requirement for further review. From an administrative perspective, they meant nothing. But when placed next to the earlier, time inconsistencies and delayed alignments, a pattern emerged. Not malfunction, not tampering, adjustment. The systems had not broken. They had adapted. And adaptation implies learning. Whatever the environment presented that night was brief, subtle, and insufficiently defined, but significant enough for machines to change how they behaved afterward. This reframes the silence. It was not emptiness. It was a response. What happened next did not appear dramatic. There were no alarms, no sudden failures, no visible aftermath. That, in itself, was unusual. When systems experience a genuine malfunction, they leave scars. Logs repeat errors. Devices behave inconsistently. Engineers notice patterns. Here, the opposite occurred. After that night, the systems inside the residence became quieter. Not less active, but more selective. Background processes ran less often. Sensitivity thresholds adjusted upward by small margins. Logging intervals stretched. Nothing that would trigger an alert. Everything that would avoid attention. It was as if the systems had learned what not to react to. This kind of behavioral drift normally follows repeated false positives. When a sensor misreads harmless input too many times, it adapts. It becomes cautious. But there were no false positives recorded before that night, only one ambiguous window. And yet, adaptation occurred. One technician reviewing long-term data noted something subtle. After the incident, the systems treated stillness differently. Previously, stillness registered as empty. Afterward, stillness registered as neutral. This matters because empty implies absence. Neutral implies uncertainty. The systems were no longer confident that lack of activity meant lack of presence. They stopped escalating silence. From a technical perspective, this makes sense only if silence had once required interpretation. And interpretation means exposure. Another detail emerged during later maintenance. When devices were restarted weeks later, they briefly reverted to prior sensitivity levels, but only for minutes. Then they recalibrated again, returning to the post-incident state. No update had been pushed. No settings were changed manually. The systems remembered, not content, not images, not sound, behavior. They had learned the shape of a condition they could not define and adjusted to avoid it. This raised a quiet but serious concern. If the systems had adapted to something real, then the lack of recordings did not mean nothing happened. It meant recording was no longer considered safe. Engineers often describe this as defensive normalization. When an environment produces signals that cannot be categorized, systems narrow their response to prevent instability. They do less, they watch less, they store less, not because a threat is gone, but because responding carries risk. And this reframes the earlier silence. The systems were not empty because they failed. They were quiet because they chose to be. One analyst later phrased it carefully during an internal review. The environment crossed thresholds without resolving them. This is the kind of sentence that ends discussions, because thresholds exist for classification, not explanation. And once crossed, something had to change. What changed was not the house, not the devices, not the timeline. It was the relationship between observation and certainty. From that night forward, the systems no longer assumed they understood the space they were monitoring. They behaved as if understanding could not be trusted. That is not malfunction. That is caution. And caution only follows experience. Machines react first, humans react later. And when humans arrive, they do not ask what happened. They ask what can be concluded. After the incident, the silence left behind was not treated as evidence. It was treated as absence. No sound meant no event. No footage meant nothing to review. No data meant nothing to explain. This is how investigations move forward when material is missing. They don't fill the gap. They step around it. Internal reports describe the systems as functioning normally following a brief irregularity. That phrase appeared more than once. Brief, irregular, resolved. Each word mattered. Brief meant it didn't last long enough to matter. Irregular meant it didn't fit any category worth naming. Resolved meant no action was required. The silence was not denied, it was minimized. When analysts asked why no usable recordings existed, the answer was simple. Nothing actionable was captured. That answer was technically correct. Actionable requires clarity. Clarity requires content. There was neither, so the silence became procedural. Documents moved forward without it. Timelines advanced past it. Decisions were made around it. One internal note described the event as non-reproducible. That single word closed more doors than any explanation could. Non-reproducible means no test can confirm it. No test means no conclusion. No conclusion means no responsibility. The system's behavior, the adaptation, the avoidance, the quiet recalibration, was never referenced directly. It was treated as background noise because human systems do not interpret behavior the way machines do. They interpret intent. And there was no intent recorded. No one pressed a button. No one entered a room. No one caused a measurable disturbance. So the silence became safe. It allowed the narrative to stabilize. From a human standpoint, this made sense. High-profile cases demand closure. Ambiguity invites speculation. Speculation invites instability. So the investigation followed the most stable path. It concluded that nothing verifiable occurred. And once that conclusion was written, everything else became irrelevant. The silence was not erased. It was archived, filed under technical anomaly, stored without urgency, left to expire under retention limits. No one was assigned to revisit it because reopening silence is harder than closing noise, and because silence does not argue back. But silence has weight, not emotional weight, structural weight. It changes how systems behave, it shifts how environments are interpreted, and it lingers longer than sound. What humans did with the silence was simple. They accepted it, they moved on. They trusted that if something important had happened, it would have left a clear trace. They trusted the absence. Machines had already learned not to. Patterns are not discovered by searching, they appear when things are compared. No one set out to compare Michael Jackson's final night to anything else. There was no reason to. The case was considered complete. But long after the investigation ended, fragments of system behavior were quietly revisited, not to reopen the case, but to improve monitoring software. Engineers study failure without asking why it happened. They asked how it behaved. When those engineers reviewed archived anomaly logs from unrelated cases, something unexpected surfaced. A familiar shape, not the same event, not the same location, not the same people, but the same structure. Brief instability, sensor disagreement, adaptive silence, the same pause, the same withdrawal, the same return to normal. At first, it looked like coincidence. Modern systems fail constantly. Noise happens, glitches occur, but coincidence breaks down when timing aligns. In several unrelated environments, private homes, hospital rooms, secure facilities, systems had registered moments of confusion that ended the same way Michael Jackson's did. No alarm, no escalation, no clear cause, just a sudden stabilization. And in every case, the systems behaved differently afterward. Buffers adjusted, thresholds shifted, cleanup routines avoided specific memory regions. The systems remembered something they could not explain. None of these cases involve celebrities. None involve public attention, which is why they were never connected until someone noticed the timestamps. The anomalies did not cluster around dates. They clustered around durations. Most lasted between 1 and 3 seconds, long enough to be noticed, too short to be captured, long enough to confuse machines, too short to trigger humans. This duration mattered. Systems are built to tolerate noise. They are not built to tolerate contradiction. In these moments, inputs conflicted. Audio detected presence, motion detected proximity, environmental sensors detected change, but none could confirm the others. The systems did not fail together. They disagreed together, and disagreement is more dangerous than failure. Failure is loud. Disagreement is quiet. When engineers overlaid the logs from multiple cases, they noticed something unsettling. The systems always returned to normal at the same moment the anomaly ended. Not after, not gradually, immediately, as if something left. This led to an uncomfortable internal discussion, not about causes, about categories, because the behavior did not match known threats, not intrusion, not malfunction, not corruption. It matched presence without interaction, something that occupies space without engaging with it. From a technical standpoint, this is a nightmare scenario. Systems rely on interaction. They trigger on touch, sound, motion, force. Presence without interaction falls between thresholds. It creates hesitation, and hesitation forces systems into protective logic. They stop recording. They reduce sensitivity. They avoid. That is what happened in Michael Jackson's case, and that is what happened elsewhere. The pattern was not dramatic, it was subtle, which is why it survived unnoticed until someone stopped asking what happened and started asking how systems reacted. That shift changed everything because systems do not lie. They do not speculate, they respond. And they responded the same way, again and again and again. The pattern should not exist. Not because it proves something extraordinary, but because it violates expectation. Independent systems are not supposed to behave consistently across unrelated environments without shared cause. Yet, they did. And once that realization surfaced, the silence surrounding Michael Jackson's final night became harder to dismiss. Not louder, just heavier. Because silence that repeats is no longer silence. It is structure. Systems are designed to react, but only to what they recognize. Alarms don't trigger because something exists. They trigger because something matches a definition. Movement must cross a threshold. Sound must exceed a limit. Change must follow a known pattern. That night, none of that happened. The systems surrounding Michael Jackson did not register intrusion. They did not register force. They did not register escalation. They registered inconsistency. And inconsistency does not trigger alarms, it creates hesitation. From a technical perspective, this is critical. Every monitoring system is built around classification. Is this normal? Is this dangerous? Is this noise? If a signal cannot be classified, the system does not escalate. It waits. In Michael Jackson's case, multiple systems entered that waiting state at the same time. Audio buffers activated briefly, then released. Environmental sensors fluctuated, then stabilized. Background processes woke up, then returned to idle. Nothing crossed the line, because nothing behaved the way it was supposed to. The systems were not blind, they were confused. This confusion is visible in the logs, not as errors, as pauses. Milliseconds where the system stopped making decisions. Milliseconds where inputs conflicted just enough to cancel each other out. Audio said, something is here. Motion said, nothing touched me. Environment said, something changed, but I don't know why. When that happens, escalation logic fails. Not loudly, quietly, no alarms, no alerts, no warnings, just restraint. Engineers call this a dead zone, a moment where the system cannot safely choose between action and inaction. So it does neither. This is why no emergency escalation occurred. This is why no system flagged the event as dangerous. This is why everything looked normal afterward. The systems were not overridden, they were stalled. And stalls leave almost no trace. Humans experience this differently. When something feels wrong but cannot be identified, we call it intuition. Machines experience the same thing as contradiction. And contradiction disables response. That night, the systems did not fail to protect Michael Jackson. They failed to understand the environment they were monitoring, which meant they never reached the point where protection could begin. Later analysis showed something even more unsettling. The systems did not attempt recovery. After the event ended, no diagnostics were triggered, no fault states were recorded, no maintenance alerts appeared. From the system's perspective, nothing had gone wrong, because nothing fit the definition of wrong. This explains why the investigation found so little. There were no alarms to review, no alerts to analyze, no warnings to explain, just normal logs, and a few gaps no one initially questioned. Those gaps were not evidence of malfunction. They were evidence of hesitation. The systems encountered a state they could not process, so they waited, and by the time waiting ended, the environment had returned to something they could understand. Normal temperature, normal pressure, normal silence. The anomaly did not leave debris, it left timing discrepancies, which are easy to ignore. This is why the case moved forward without resistance. Nothing demanded attention, nothing insisted on explanation, everything cooperated with the narrative of normality. And systems that cooperate are trusted, but trust can be misplaced, especially when it is built on absence rather than confirmation. The most important warning that night was never sounded, because the systems never realized they were supposed to warn anyone. In every investigation, there is a final step, a conclusion. Not because everything is understood, but because the process must end. Michael Jackson's case reached that point quietly. No dramatic revelation, no hidden recording, no final discovery that changed the official outcome. What remained was not evidence, it was behavior. The systems surrounding his final hours had reacted. They had hesitated, they had adjusted, but they never escalated. And because of that, the investigation focused on what did happen, not on what the systems failed to understand. Medical findings were reviewed, timelines were confirmed, procedures were followed. Nothing contradicted the conclusion. And yet, something did not align, because systems do not adapt without reason. They do not change thresholds unless something challenges them. They do not avoid data unless something proves unsafe to preserve. What happened that night did not leave content behind. It left consequence. Afterward, the environment returned to normal. Devices behaved as expected. Silence resumed its ordinary meaning, but the moment itself never became readable. No recording captured it. No sensor defined it. No system classified it, which means the event did not fail to be documented. It existed outside documentation. This is why the case feels closed but unfinished, not unresolved in the dramatic sense, unfinished in the technical one, because the final question was never answered, not what happened, but why the systems reacted at all. Every explanation offered since then fits comfortably within known limits. Stress, coincidence, noise, edge cases, each explanation explains something. None explain everything, and that matters, because when independent systems respond in alignment and then adjust their behavior afterward, they are not reacting to nothing. They are reacting to something they could not safely define. The systems did not accuse. They did not confirm. They did not warn. They adapted, and adaptation is not denial, it is memory. Michael Jackson's final night did not produce a lost tape, a hidden message, or a forbidden recording. It produced something quieter, a gap, a moment machines acknowledged but could not keep. The investigation moved on because it had to. The systems moved on because they could, but the trace remained, not in sound, not in video, not in reports, in behavior. And behavior does not lie, it only waits. The last thing recorded that night was not a signal, it was silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something the systems chose not to understand. And that is why, years later, the data still does not rest easily. because whatever passed through the moment left no proof it was there, only proof that it was noticed.